Okay, I think we will go ahead and get started. I know people are in transition, and that's fine, so you'll just miss my few introductory comments, and that is okay. But let me introduce myself. I am Natalie Hudson, and I am the Director of the Human Rights Studies program here, which is the undergraduate degree program for human rights. And so I have the pleasure of working with undergraduates on a daily basis who are pursuing degrees in human rights studies, many of whom are in the room today. Our panel today is focused on questions related to a human rights-based approach to development. And there's a lot of different ways to think about this, as we will see from our panelists' comments throughout the session. The right to development actually first emerged a couple of decades ago when countries, struggles of poor countries that is, really sought to get a better deal in terms of the global economic system. And so we sort of talk about the development as a human right, and there was a declaration on this in 1986. Contrast this development as a human right is one that focuses on the struggles of individuals, on poor people, as opposed to poor countries, and that's something different. The struggles of poor people for development to realize their rights is known as the rights-based approach to development. And this developed about the same time in the 80s. A lot of that was built upon alliances that were made between the human rights community and development community in the context of CEDAW, which is the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination of all forms of discrimination against women, and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And so we saw interesting synergies between rights advocates and development advocates in those two contexts. But this rights-based approach to development was driven by development agencies and civil society organizations to promote development programs that were based on human rights principles. And the aims to sort of reorient development along the lines of human rights theory and practice. But we also saw a human rights organization focusing on development issues. Amnesty International in 2010, for example, had their annual campaign was on global poverty, and this was a real shift for Amnesty International if we think about their historical development. So it's in that context that I've asked our panelists to speak about what does it mean in their work to take a human rights-based approach to development? What does that look like to engage sort of two sets of actors, two sets of discourses, laws, policies in different ways? And what are the practical advantages of trying to incorporate human rights language, human rights law into development work and vice versa? But also to think about what are the limitations of such an approach, of such an engagement. And I think these questions really speak to some of the questions that were put forth by, or critiques, I would say, put forth by the panelists in the first session this morning. Larry Cox and Louis Bickford in particular talked about the need for the human rights community to focus on development. So not just how do development agencies engage in human rights language and laws and policies, but how does the human right movement engage in development, and really to think about poverty as a defining issue for the human rights movement in the 21st century. So I've asked our panelists to speak about 10 minutes this morning on these questions, that's all. So it's no small task, but what we'll do is allow each to speak about 10 minutes, and then we will open up for discussion and dialogue amongst the panelists and of course with you all, and we look forward to your comments. So we're going to begin with Dr. Mark Ensalaco, and many of you have had interactions with him over the last couple of days and prior to that. And I think it's interesting to, as I was reflecting on introducing Mark, how his career has evolved here at the University of Dayton, and how his vocation has really shifted over time in terms of coming to UD as a Latin Americanist. And I had the privilege of taking one of those, or two of those classes when I was here as an undergraduate. And then to focus on global terrorism and the war on terrorism in the context of a rights-based framework. And then he get into human trafficking, and all of a sudden now he's talking about development and poverty as these, as the underlying structural factors of driving human rights problems today. And so to think about sort of that reinvention of himself and his scholarship and his advocacy is really profound. So it's my pleasure to first introduce Dr. Mark Ensalaco, Director of Human Rights Research here at UD.
Thank you, Natalie. It's interesting to be introduced by someone who was your student and now directs the program that you helped found. I was 15 when I came to the university. But thank you. And it's great to be here, and thank you for all for coming to this conference. I'm going to relate the theme of this plenary, integrating human rights and development practice, to the mission and the work of the Human Rights Center we're establishing here at the University of Dayton. You heard the president's announcement yesterday, right? There are really two essential aspects of the work of the center as we envision it. First, we're going to focus on the study of advocacy. We're going to conduct research with and for human rights and development organizations to provide them the analytical support they need to do their work. We will work at the frontier of research and advocacy. That's first, right? But second, we're going to focus on the structural causes of human rights violations and search for transformative solutions to systemic patterns of injustice. So to say, the center is committed to the theory and practice of transformative human rights advocacy. So here I want to concentrate on that second aspect and relate it to this question of integrating human rights and development for practice. For over a decade or so, as Natalie said, we've been talking about a human rights approach to development. Our center essentially inverts this formulation. We're going to take a developmental approach to human rights. And let me explain what that means and frame this as a scholar. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights proclaims that everyone is entitled to a social and international order in which he or she may fully realize their human rights. But it doesn't tell us what that order looks like. The covenants on economic, social, and cultural rights say the ideal of free human beings can only be achieved if conditions are created whereby everyone can enjoy their civil and political rights as well as their economic and social and cultural rights. But the covenants don't tell us what those conditions are. And it's frustrating, isn't it? So I sort of contend, if you actually read the Universal Declaration of Human Rights very closely, or the covenants or the other major conventions very closely, if we give the Declaration, the covenants a close reading, it becomes fairly obvious what actions we must take to create the conditions in which human beings can enjoy freedom from fear and want. First, we must promote the institutions of democracy and the rule of law. Second, we must eliminate all forms of discrimination. Third, we must eradicate dehumanizing poverty. And finally, all of this presupposes as a precondition that we must work to make recognition of the inherent dignity of the human person the guiding principle of all our political, economic, social, and other institutions, right? So I think human rights is all about human dignity and free and full development of the human person. That phrase, the free and full development of the human person, appears 3 times in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's really about development of the human person. So to return to this question of development, I wish to make the point that I think it would be beneficial for us to give some consideration to the nexus between the integral development of the human person and the integral development of human communities in which the human person freely and fully develops their human personality. So let me relate this again directly to the mission of the center. The center is going to focus on the structural causes of human rights violations in the search for transformative solutions. We believe that the most effective human rights advocacy strategies are those that are directed towards the creation of the conditions that will enable everyone to enjoy the full panoply of human rights. The transformation of systematic patterns of injustice means logically the creation of conditions for justice. So we're looking at structural causes. A simple explanation, a simple example here, excuse me. The Emerging Center's first major applied research project concerns forced labor in Brazil in the Andean region and CRS, and we signed the MOU yesterday. We already have a solid empirical understanding of the structural causes behind forced labor in the region: landlessness, poverty, discrimination against the poor, the exploitive business practices of large estates and agro-business enterprises, deforestation, right? And the absence of rule of law in broad swaths of the region. These are the structural causes. The poor migrate. Poor migrants are vulnerable to fraud and deception and coercion and force, the other elements of trafficking. The absence of the rule of law enables traffickers to exploit the poor, and so on and so on and so on. We have a solid sense of the structural causes of forced labor and human trafficking in the region. Now, we have all sorts of strategies to combat human trafficking: rescue, restore, rehabilitate, and all those things. But if we want to abolish trafficking or forced labor, we must direct our efforts at the elimination of these systematic patterns of injustice, or conversely, we must focus our efforts at the creation of the conditions that foster justice for these people. So we want to look beyond symptoms to the root causes. So these observations direct us to think more intentionally about integrating human rights and development in practice. They speak to what I'm calling a developmental approach to human rights. The creation and conditions that, now here's the point, the creation of conditions that enable human beings to freely develop their human personality, right? Eliminating these structural causes. This sounds more like the work of development NGOs than human rights NGOs, right? Or to oversimplify, human rights NGOs advocate for rights of others, generally by demanding that governments conform to universal standards of conduct. Human rights NGOs document and denounce, they name and shame, and so on. Developmental NGOs, again to oversimplify, focus more directly and intentionally on the creation of the conditions that promote human dignity, poverty reduction, capacity building, and so on and so on. Advocacy is crucial, we all know that, because confrontation is often necessary. It seems obvious that the denunciation of dictatorial violence and corruption is a necessary first step at the promotion of democracy and the rule of law, for example. But addressing systematic patterns of injustice demands more than merely calling them out. The elimination of discrimination, the eradication of extreme poverty, and even the establishment of the institutions of democracy and the rule of law, these ultimately demand patient, methodical development work. Development work would still be necessary even if all governments were generally committed to the protection and promotion of human rights. And even if they were willing to devote the maximum of available resources to ensure everyone in existence worthy of human dignity, which is the fundamental obligation of the Covenant in Civil and Political Rights. Even if governments were all for human rights, you would still have to lift people out of poverty. You would still have to do development work. So the integration of human rights and development practice demands that human rights and development NGOs and other actors in civil society work together more intentionally, collaboratively, and synergistically. I realize that there's many examples where this is going on, but I worry, to sort of echo Alex Duvall here, that the organizational dynamics that drive human rights and development NGOs as organizations too often impede effective collaboration. There are any number of factors, including the exigencies of funding, public and media relations, and so on, that tend to make human rights and development NGOs competing businesses, to use Duvall's terms again. This competition for resources and attentions can lead to the divergence rather than the convergence of efforts too often. NGOs as organizations may benefit from this, but not so the poor and the persecuted they are supposed to serve. So to conclude, the Human Rights Center here at the University of Dayton, the work of the Human Rights Center here at the University of Dayton encompasses research, education, and dialogue. These remarks, indeed this conference, is about dialogue. First, dialogue between researchers and advocates. This is what we mean by working at the frontiers of research and advocacy. We believe research is advocacy. We believe that the Academy is an important player in the global human rights community, and we want to bring that out. Second, this conference is about dialogue between human rights, humanitarian, and development NGOs and other actors in international civil society, including transnational corporations who need to live up to their pledge of corporate social responsibility. We want them in the dialogue, right? So the center's focus is on research, education, and dialogue. This conference is about dialogue. I can announce to you, yesterday the president announced the intention of the university in the near future to create a human rights center. It's actually operating already. I can announce to you as director of research that this conference will be the first of a series of biennial conferences by this title, Charting the Frontiers of Research and Advocacy. This will be the flagship of the center we are creating. We will resume and convene this dialogue biennially, and we invite you back. So we'll continue the process we've begun here: critical introspection, constructive critique, and the search for transformative solutions to systematic patterns of injustice. Thank you.
Okay, Thank you very much, Mark. And I think it's, I appreciate the contrast to sort of talking about a human rights-based approach to development and a developmental approach to human rights research and advocacy. So now I'm going to turn the microphone over here to my left to Ambassador Tony Hall. Tony Hall was appointed ambassador in 2002 to UN agencies for food and agriculture. Prior to that, he had served almost 24 years in Congress, representing the 3rd District of Ohio, so he's one of our own. While he was serving in Congress, he was the chairman of the House Select Committee on Hunger, where he authored all sorts of legislation related to food aid and child survival and basic education, microenterprise and primary health. While he was there, he also founded the Congressional Friends of Human Rights Monitors. In his work, he's traveled the world and is now serving as the executive director of the Alliance to End Hunger, an alliance with over 75 members. So he has a lot to offer in terms of thinking about this intersection of human rights research and advocacy with development work and practice. So I'll hand it over to him. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Natalie, and I am excited about being here. I appreciate being part of and listening to such a distinguished group of human rights advocates from this country and around the world. And I congratulate the University of Dayton on taking a lead on many issues, but especially on this issue. So dear to my heart and dear to the heart of so many of you, this advocacy of human rights here and throughout the world. You know, you hear a lot about Washington, D.C. these days. The shutdown, but, you know, I used to represent this area. I represented this area for 24 years. I was born and lived about a quarter of a mile from here, where as the crow flies, right over the hill. So I grew up in this area, and just after I was elected, my wife and I were getting ready to move to Washington, D.C. This is well over 30 years ago. And my daughter at the time was about 4 years old. She must have been hearing my wife and I talk about Washington. You know, it's a rough place. It's partisan. It's tough. I always said, if you want a friend in Washington, get a dog. But anyway, and at that time, Washington was known as the crime center of the USA. So my daughter must have been hearing all this. We didn't realize my daughter was listening in. So that night, prior to moving to Washington, D.C., this is what she was praying as I was walking past the room. She was on her knees, and she was saying, well, God, I guess it's time to say goodbye. For tomorrow, we're moving to Washington, D.C. I'll tell you what's interesting. While I was in the U.S. Congress, one of the first committees I was chosen to be on was the Foreign Affairs Committee. And the first committee that I was chosen to be on, the first subcommittee, was the Human Rights Subcommittee. And there was no competition to be on the Human Rights Subcommittee. Nobody wanted to be on it. And so I had the whole committee practically to myself. The chairman oftentimes was not there because he was on other committees. And what happened was I became kind of an expert on East Timor, the Philippines, South Korea, child soldiers, trafficking in women, you name it. All the issues came to my subcommittee, and I oftentimes was the chairman and sometimes the only person in the room, at least at our table, and an audience full of human rights advocates. And it was a great, great experience for me. And I learned so much about human rights and about the issue. And, you know, this issue of human rights, this issue of development, there's not a lot of competition because there's no votes here. Most of the people we represent, if we're not talking about people in the United States, they're outside the country. They don't vote. They don't have political PACs. And so oftentimes in elected officials' eyes, they don't count. So there was no competition to be on this committee, but I loved it. After a while in Congress, I began to specialize and key in on one particular kind of human rights. And in the hopes of becoming an expert in that, and this was the issue of food, food security, food as a weapon, water, sanitation, agriculture, microcredit. Simply put, I focused on one of the most basic of individual rights, the right to eat. And eventually I became chairman of the subcommittee on hunger, and then I became chairman of the full committee, the select committee on hunger. Focus on this right not only opened my eyes to a lack of basic rights, but it also opened a door to view the absolute poorest of the poor, the most vulnerable people in the world. I got involved in this issue probably because I was in, I think it probably started in the Peace Corps. I was in the Peace Corps in the late 60s and learned a lot by living with the poor and speaking a different language. And I was in the country of Thailand, learned about trafficking in women then. But then I really became involved in the issue in 1984 when I went to Ethiopia. At that time, I was chairman of the select committee or the subcommittee on hunger in the Congress. And Ethiopia was facing this horrendous famine. And I went with Mother Teresa's group, Sisters of Charity, went up country, and we went to the small clinic that Mother Teresa had. The clinic was probably about half the size of this room. And as I walked in, there were two nuns there and a traveling doctor, and he said, "Come with me outside." We walked outside, and there were thousands of people there, Ethiopians that had been walking for well over 100 miles, and they were starving because there was a civil war on, there was a drought, the drought turned into famine. And as I was walking between these thousands of people that looked practically dead, and some of them were, I saw 25 children die. As a matter of fact, mothers handed me their children that were dead, thinking that I was a doctor or something. They thought I could do something about it. And I never got over that. I was stunned by that. Next 3 days, that's all I saw were dead children. And I thought to myself, flying home on the plane, that there's a lot of things we do in Congress that really don't amount to much. I thought, this is what I'm going to work on. I'm going to work on hunger. I'm going to work on this issue. I'm going to be an advocate. And so I traveled the world, traveled to 130 nations, and worked on a lot of legislation, was involved in a lot of programs, and got involved like a lot of you. And while it could be argued that we live in a different world today, the plight of the most vulnerable remains the same. So as we look at the world today, what's going on as far as the human rights of hungry people? Well, before the day's up, there'll be 25,000 people that will die today. 25,000 died yesterday. 25,000 will die tomorrow. There's 1 billion people today that are starving. Almost half the world lives on $2 a day or less. In our own country, in America today, 48 million people are hungry. 48 million in this great country of ours. Now, it's not the type of hunger in America that you see in Sudan or North Korea or the Congo. They're not dropping dead in America, but they are the working poor, they are the elderly, they are going to bed 2 or 3 days out of every month without eating. And these are the working poor. These are senior citizens. These are the 2 senior citizens that I saw in Appalachia not too long ago, where they were both in their late 70s, and they were on Social Security, their fixed incomes, and that's all they had, and she had cancer. And when I saw them, they were stretching a can of tomato soup for 2 weeks. That's a human rights violation. And it's like that among our 48 million people in this country. All of us on this panel have been asked to address this issue, adopting a human rights approach to development. And for example, the question may be posed, can it or could it be argued that this approach may have a detrimental effect on development and hunger? And I would say the answer to that question is no. There can be an unfortunate disconnect between the idea of international development and sense of power relations and human rights sensitivity. But using human rights in one's approach to development and the whole issue of advocating for the vulnerable and hungry is absolutely essential. This might surprise you. I just saw this poll. But even the American people believe this. I saw the results of a recent survey that was formalized for a committee that I serve on for AID. It was a survey of 1,000 adults across this country, measures American awareness and attitudes related to global hunger. When respondents were asked if they agreed that we, the United States, do we have a moral obligation, this was the question, to end hunger around the world, 28% responded that they completely agreed, and 39% responding that they mostly agreed. That's 67% of the people responding said that we had a moral obligation. So this issue of the human rights isn't an important issue among American people, that we help people, that we speak at. It is. It is. So here's the problem. While the people seem to be way ahead of elected officials in these attitudes of morality, the particulars are more complicated. Many of us would not be faulted for asking our officials, how can you allow something like this to happen? The injustices of the world, the trafficking, the disappearances, the torture, the hungry people in our own country. Well, first, our elected officials, they don't know about the issue. They don't know. Some of them don't care, but most of them don't know. They are often not development experts, nor should we expect them to be. What they do understand is that they must make programs more cost effective. In development, this can mean raising people out of poverty, but it does not necessarily mean reaching the poorest of the poor. And that's our problem. Our elected officials have to actually see the hungry and downtrodden. They have to feel their pain. They got to walk around in it. They got to smell it. Their hearts need to be touched. And that's impossible to do when they simply read Congressional Research Service reports. I remember taking 2 congressmen overseas, 2 good friends. I'm a Democrat. They were Republicans. And we changed their mind. They went overseas. I showed them what poverty was. I showed them kids that were sick, HIV, AIDS, bad projects, hurting people. And they came back and their life changed. My point is, we need to work together better. I listened to the panel this morning. The panel said some amazing things. And they said some things that human rights has done well, but some of the things that human rights has not done very well is, and I include my hunger advocates, is we don't work together. We don't work together. As Mark said, you know, we got our groups that we have to raise money for, and we got our individual constituencies. We don't work together. If we work together, can you imagine if we put our constituencies together? The poor, the sick, the elite. And we are too elite. We talk to each other. We don't talk to our constituency. We're not educating our people. And we need to mentor our elected officials. I know that when I went to Ethiopia my life changed. When I take congressmen overseas and I touch their heart, they change. We need to mentor elected officials. Why? Why do we do that? We do that because I think Martin Luther said a couple hundred years ago, he said, you know, we need to send our good people into the church. We need to send our best into politics. We're not sending our best into politics. We're not teaching them. We're not mentoring them. I got a lot more to say, but I've been given a note that I've been speaking too long. Thank you.
Thank you so much. The hope is that we will have time to get to some of those other comments in the Q&A and the dialogue that will follow these presentations. So thank you very much. It is now my pleasure to introduce Mr. Bill OKeefe. Bill OKeefe comes to us from Catholic Relief Services, where he works as Vice President for Advocacy there. That role is really focused on changing U.S. foreign policy to promote social justice and to reduce poverty overseas. So he has certainly a lot to add to this discussion on a human rights-based approach to development. What's more is that Mr. OKeefe has been a part of CRS since 1987, and he has worn many hats there and has had many different experiences in his work there. He worked as a project manager in Tanzania, working on HIV and AIDS issues. He was also part of, or a director of, the flagship program Operation Rice Bowl. And then worked as director of church outreach, so he, among other things. And so he's had various roles and worked in various capacities for this major international organization that is really at the intersection of human rights work and development work. So I will turn it over to you. Thanks, Bill.
Thank you very much, Natalie, and thank you, everybody. It's been great to be a part of this conference. I've learned a huge amount. It's also been very humbling. I feel like anytime I'm talking and Tony Hall is not talking is not a good use of your time. But hopefully I'll be able to add something. What I'm going to do quickly is contrast a little bit CRS's Catholic social justice view with a rights-based approach to development. They're very, 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 very similar, but not exactly the same in my opinion. I just want to put that out there. To talk about the framework that CRS does look at all its work through, and I think bring out the rights elements thereof. And then 3, give some examples of how that plays out practically in activities that we do. If there's time, I'm going to also talk about some of the limitations, so we'll see how that goes. First of all, Catholic teaching, Catholic social thought around the idea of rights. I'm going to highlight a couple things that I think are a little bit different. One is Catholic teaching emphasizes rights that individuals have as being created in the image and likeness of God, every single person, but also emphasizes responsibilities and duties to the individual. And I think that's important. Individuals thrive in family, community, and society, and are not autonomous beings. And sometimes I think the human rights discourse is more on the legal individual side, and Catholic teaching has a very broad view of the of human thriving within families, societies, communities. Catholic teaching also talks about solidarity, that we owe each other the solidarity and concern as members of one human family, and has very rich teaching around there. So those are, and finally, Catholic teaching explicitly gives what's called a preferential option for the poor, which, you know, is sort of like you get extra credit if you're really targeting to the poorest of the poor. But it really, based on the teaching of Jesus Christ, I think says we as a society have to especially focus on the most vulnerable and the poor. So, and I think human rights talks about, it doesn't quite have that same kind of extra credit push, let's put it that way. Okay, so those are some differences that I see. Now, at CRS, we have a programming framework called IHD, Integral Human Development Framework. And basically, I'm going to paint a picture of it for you so you can imagine what it is. And you have a diagram on the left side are the assets that a household has. Those are economic assets, political assets, health, the whole range, spiritual assets, the whole range of things that we as individuals and families bring to the table. And a lot of traditional development really kind of focused on that. How do you increase the assets that individuals and families have so that they can have successful outcomes? Then on the right side of our little diagram, we have systems and structures. And here is the systems and structures of poverty and injustice that people who have access to those systems and structures are better able to increase their assets. And of course, if you have more assets, you're better able to use those systems and structures. So our strategy is both to help people to build on their assets and increase the range of integral human assets that we all have, as well as to address the systems and structures of poverty and injustice that prevent people from increasing their assets and moving forward with their lives and reaching their full human potential. And we apply that framework in our thinking in the countries where we're operating, which we're in 90 countries, and in the projects that we are supporting. So how does that work out practically? I'm going to give a couple of examples. First of all, I talked about the preferential option of the poor. That really pushes us to focus on the most vulnerable versus what I'm going to call the market viable. And this is a big debate in Washington circles, like in debates with the government about supporting microfinance. It's a big debate in the current administration's new agricultural program, Feed the Future. You can always cherry pick the folks who are pretty much ready to get involved in the market. But our goal is to force ourselves and to advocate that the government be pushing that economic ladder all the way down to the last person, basically, so that we are pulling up the not just the market viable, but the most vulnerable. So that's the preferential option for the poor really does that. And we have a great project right now in Nicaragua where we're working with Walmart, which has a subsidiary there, and they are buying all sorts of fruits and vegetables in the local market. We are working with very poor small farmers and helping them to develop the capacity to join that market system. In other words, to develop the products and the quality standards so that they can sell to Walmart, which provides a very large market. So that's a specific example of focusing on the most vulnerable and not just the market viable. Second of all, focusing on empowerment. One of the most profound projects I ever saw of CRS's was in India, and it was in a village near Ahmedabad, which is north of Mumbai. And in this village, there was a traditional caste structure, and there were a number of people who were actually what were called subcaste. They were indigenous people who existed below the official caste structure that the predominantly Hindu culture prescribed. These folks, their job in this system was to go out in the morning and clean up after everybody having gone to the bathroom in the middle of the night. That was their responsibility in the village. And I remember I had just had my young son, and I envisioned what was going to be the conversation with the father and his son when he said, here's what you're predestined to do. They weren't allowed to own land. They were extremely poor. Our local partner there, which was a Jesuit parish, Catholic Jesuit parish, worked with us on some agricultural technologies, which are basically some, I'm going to say, to save time in explaining, some bushes that grew in salty areas. There was all these desalinated salt flats that the landowners there couldn't use. So we helped these folks to plant these bushes in these salty areas, and they started to those bushes grew, and they started to harvest wood from them, sell the wood, And then gradually, also the land became arable, and they were able to harvest some crops. As soon as they did that, the landowner said, whoa, wait a minute, this looks like good land. That's our land, and tried to force them off the land. And our partner, with our support, helped them to organize, go to the district, and demand their rights. So that, to me, is an example of empowerment and providing over time and helping people to come to an understanding of their full human dignity and the rights that they brought to the table. The third element is just to focus on advocacy. And, we try to link our advocacy with the work we're doing in the field. I'll give an example in the Congo. In the Congo, we have programs that respond directly to gender-based violence, the terrible problem of rape as a result of the war there. We're supporting health clinics. We're supporting doctors, nurses. We're also supporting an early warning system of local organizations that when there's a movement of rebel groups, villages get a notice, and people are able to flee before they are overtaken and attacked. But that obviously is just responding to symptoms. And so what we've been doing as well is dealing with the problem of extractive industries. So the whole problem in Congo, most of you I think are aware of this, is driven by the money that people can earn by extracting a whole range of minerals out of the ground and then selling them illicitly. And so we were very much a part of, in Washington, inserting a provision in the Dodd Financial Reform Act that would set up a regulatory regime for these minerals from Congo. And we managed to, with many other groups, succeed, and it was a great moment because we were able to address to advocate to address a root cause of the rape and violence that was happening in the Congo. And that lens, coming from, again, our integral human development, is why we do that. Finally, I'm just going to say a direct consequence, and I was interested in a little discussion of this in this morning's panel, is a focus on solidarity and building solidarity. Helping to build the connection between Americans, between students at Dayton, for example, and Americans of all walks of life in the human connection as a member of one human family with those we are serving around the world. And that is part of our responsibility that comes from Catholic social teaching. Some of that is a result of, the responsibility to witness to atrocities and to report on them. Some of that is just our responsibility as part of the Catholic Church in the United States to engage Catholics in the full mission of the Church, of which this is a key part. So, in terms of limitations, do I have a minute or not? I have 1 minute. Woohoo! Okay. I've been watching sort of out of the corner of my eye, testing my peripheral vision here. Just a couple of comments. One thing that I think is, for us, the question of what is justice? And is justice the legal bringing someone to trial for atrocities that they have committed? Or is there a broader definition of justice, and how does that play out in different places? In Rwanda, for example, we have been very much involved with the local Catholic Church there in sort of reconciliation processes where people who literally, have killed other people went and were able to find peace with the relatives of people who they killed. I don't know if that fits in the human rights discourse, but it fits in a Catholic sense of redemption and reconciliation. There's an emphasis, I think, in human rights discourse of holding governments accountable, which is extremely important, but I sometimes think the problem now is we have lack of accountability, but we also have lack of government capacity. And as we're sort of tearing governments down, we have to make sure we're not just in the deconstruction mode. We need a lot more government capacity around the world if we expect people to flourish, if we expect human rights to be respected. And so getting that balance right, I think, is a very tricky thing. Finally, just, as an operational group, you know, we're constantly struggling with the balance of having people on the ground and partners in risking their lives to address dangerous situations and then being the witness to that and sort of naming and shaming and proclaiming and screaming and yelling because we're afraid that our staff are going to get a bullet in the back of the head. And so we are, that is just it's a huge issue for us. There are places that have terrible human rights abuses where we are silent because we have chosen that our charism is best expressed through meeting the human needs and supporting local people on the ground. But I can tell you we lose many hours of sleep wondering whether we did the right thing in particular situations. All right, thanks so much.
Thank you. Okay, now I'd like to introduce Rosalie Nezien. Am I saying that correctly?
Yes.
Okay. Rosalie comes to us from the American Jewish World Service, where she works at the grants department there. She's been there since 2009, so for the past 4 years, she's been overseeing grant programs in a range of human rights issues related to sexual right or reproductive and sexual health, as well as social and economic rights and some other areas that she'll speak about, and particularly in the areas of the Congo, Senegal, and Liberia for a time. She has a long history of working to support grassroots organizations. She did that when she worked at the Firelight Foundation, when she worked on HIV and AIDS issues in East and South Africa. She's also worked at Plan International and Bonifanden, her native, which is an organization in her native country of Burkina Faso. So it's with great pleasure to introduce Rosalie and hear her insights on this intersection of development and human rights work. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction and also for the opportunity for me to speak about the work of AJWS. I'm really very humbled to be sitting on this panel because Bill OKeefe knows very well the president of my organization because they spoke on panel together. And I still can't fathom how I made it to this conference because I heard about it 2 weeks ago, really. So I'm going to give you a little background about AJWS and why we use the right-based approach to development, what we see as strengths and weaknesses, and the lesson that we've learned along the way. So in terms of introduction, AJWS is an international grant-making organization that is working at the intersection between human rights and development. And this status is implied in our mission statement, which is to realize human rights and also to end poverty in the developing world by providing direct financial support to grassroots organizations working in Africa, Asia, and in the Americas. As Natalie said, we're working on issue of natural resource rights, sexual health and rights for women and girls and sexual minorities, and also on issue of civil and political rights in especially conflict and post-conflict setting. But however, in the first year of our grant making, AJWS was really more centered on providing goods and services to poor communities in the countries where we work. And we did that because we wanted to enable those communities to be able to meet the need in the absence of government support. But then over time, we realized that the causes on which we were working were more complicated. For instance, when looking at the poverty affecting farmers and indigenous people, we realized that many people did not have land, title to the land, as you mentioned. So we came to a conclusion that we needed really to work to enable community members so they can have a tool to be able to own title to their land and to have access and control to manage those resources and to begin to really fully addressing the root causes of poverty. So when we understood more the root causes of those things, so we changed our strategy. For instance, in Mexico, a Canadian company is like mining, is operating in the indigenous community of Zapotec region. We're supporting an organization in that community so they can document the right violation of community members who have not given the consent to a project in the community, so they can document their right to free, prior, and informed consent. And that right is a key principle in international human rights law. So we're supporting this organization to be able to document those rights. When we are evaluating grants, and in fact when we are entering in a relationship, we ask ourselves a series of questions. Some of them include, for instance, does our grant, is our grant going to support a one-time initiative, or is it going to fill a gap left by the government? For instance, medical services for sex workers, or is the grantee going to advocate for the government to uphold its legal or its human right obligation to provide free, equal, and quality services to all of its citizens? One other question that we ask ourselves is, does the project of a program that we're supporting, does it leave the participant with a better understanding about their rights? Do we consider those who are most excluded and those who are marginalized? And do the strategy that we're supporting or that we are using as a grant maker, do they really look at the interrelated factors of the problem that we're trying to address? So those are the kind of reasoning that we have in the back of our mind when entering a relationship or making the decision to fund a certain initiative. As a funder, we have found these ways of working as being more obviously sustainable and empowering and inclusive. It has enabled us to work with marginalized populations such as people with disability. It's compelling us to consider issue of power and inequities and to think about those people who are being discriminated against. And I think that the same thing can be said of our grants partner. And I'm lucky to have a partner here in the room, Rashmini from Sri Lanka. She's not she's coming from an organization that is not a typical grassroots organization that we're supporting, but they are strategic allies that build the capacity of a local grassroots that we're working with. So we think that the organizations that are using that framework, applying the right base to development in their work, we find them to have a different orientation to their government and also to other non-stakeholder like corporation, for instance. We think that the increased knowledge about their rights and how to go about claiming them, it supports community members to become really powerful agents of change. And it gives them a legitimate basis for doing advocacy in the country using international and national norms to human rights. As I was preparing to come here at this conference, a colleague of mine was sharing with me the story of an organization in Burma that we're supporting to promote the health right of people who are living with HIV/AIDS and men who have sex with men to have access to qualified health services. So this organization, they noticed that the staff people of an international organization were discriminated against them because when they had to receive HIV treatment, ARV kit, they were always served last. Because this organization was empowered to know discrimination and to face it, and they knew about the human rights principle of the international organization, they were able to confront the staff of that organization. And once that happened, they were treated with more dignity, and they didn't have to wait all the time, last to be served last. So we see this as really empowering for the organizations that are using them. As limit, and obviously as other people have said before me, as empowering it is to use the right framework in one's work, it also has limits. And many of the limits have already been mentioned, but the issue of time really is problematic. It takes time to yield results, and those results are incremental. And in context with governments that are repressive, it also brings about issue of security and safety for grassroots, defenders and human rights defenders. Because those organizations, they are addressing issue of power and injustice, they are seen as a threat to people who are in power, both by the government or corporation. So they face really a serious issue of risk in their work. Some speakers have mentioned also before me, in the wake of September 11, many governments have, taken advantage of the issue of national security concern to really adopt measures that group human rights defenders with terrorists in some countries. In Ethiopia, for instance, we have seen anti-NGOs law that preventing external funding to come in the country for organizations that were doing human rights work. And by organization, I mean local grassroots group in Ethiopia that were doing human rights work. They couldn't get funding because of that. Another limit that I can think of is working in setting with limited functioning government, like you mentioned. And I'm thinking now about our work in Congo. And I'm thinking about a grassroots partner that we're supporting, and that is like whose work can really illustrate the impact, both the positive impact of a right-based approach, but also its limit. So this organization is working in North Kivu province, and as most of you know, North Kivu province is in eastern DRC, and is at the center of a conflict that has lasted for decades. And the characteristic of this conflict, I think most of you also know, has been massive human rights violation against civilians, and specifically against women and girls. So in this context, the right of women and girls, because of their gender, are constantly violated. They can live free from violence, and their bodily autonomy is also violated. The country, due to pressure from grassroots organizations inside the country and internationally, has passed legislation that criminalizes gender-based violence. They have done that. But the government, as most of you know, is really hardly living up to its promise to fulfill, to protect the right of women and girls. So in this context, the partner that we're supporting, they're trying to force the government to enforce the legislation on sexual and gender-based violence. They are documenting gender crimes affecting women and girls, and then they're using those documentation to seek legal redress. They're doing advocacy also in their country at the national level and international level. For instance, in 2012 only, they documented about 245 cases of sexual and gender-based violence, and they supported 30 women groups to seek legal redress. Of this 30 groups, only one case was prosecuted that they reported to us this year. So that is problematic. But while they wait for that documentation and human rights work to pay off, they're thinking about as a strategy. They are, for instance, like providing services to the survivor with whom they're working. They have shelters in which the survivor can come and get medical services and counseling, and services that prevent them from contracting HIV/AIDS or from conceiving because of the sexual violence that they've endured. And they're also facilitating access to specialized services like surgery for survivors who need those services. So in this context, for instance, we think that the combination of advocacy and service provision is really necessary. They can't just do advocacy. It's very necessary. And it is also an entry point for them to collect data that is really critical in supporting the human rights work that they're doing and the filing of gender crimes. And we think also that they justify in doing that service provision because it gives them legitimacy to support the survivors who are in need of critical services. They can just be collecting data and filing cases. They need to address the immediate need. So in conclusion, as a founder pursuing social justice, we think that the right-based approach, our work and strategy are really grounded in that approach. It's enabling us to work with population that are left at the margin. It's enabling us to deal with issue of exclusion and structural issues. It's enabling us to do that and to really think about the long-term social change. But it's not solving all the challenges that we're encountering, for instance, in conflict setting. It's not. It has enabled us to expand our mandate and to be able to use a justice frame in our work and to ask ourselves and our partners questions that we think are helping to address the structural causes of right violation or of poverty. But I really think that it's also very important to be flexible, as other people have mentioned before me. You have to be adaptive to circumstances that are present on the ground. In some cases, doing a combination of services and human rights advocacy can work, but in some cases it cannot. So practitioners always have to think about ways to be creative and to think about opportunity and to just be ready to seize them. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the panelists for a very rich discussion in terms of thinking about human rights as a way of expanding the mandate, whether that's thinking about advocacy versus delivering of services, or structural challenges, as Mark spoke about, or the morality behind it, as Ambassador Hall referred to it, or in the terms of solidarity of doing work alongside with development agencies as opposed to let us tell you how to do your work. So I think at this point, we're best served by opening up the floor for some discussion, and in that context, allowing our panelists to also respond to one another's comments. So what I'd like to do is take 3 or 4 questions from the audience and then give each of the panelists an opportunity to respond both to your questions as well as to the other presentations, because they, I think, spoke to each other in very interesting ways, albeit indirect in some ways. So we'll take a few questions. Right here. And please stand up and introduce yourself. Thank you.
My name is Jordan Powers. I'm in Dr. Hudson's class for Politics and Human Rights. One of the questions I had that Dr. Ensalaco, sorry, did I pronounce that right? Okay. And Ambassador Hall both said is that it's really important that we all are working together, NGOs, governments, non-state actors. And we've always heard that, we've always had that saying that 2 heads are better than 1, but why do you think that this hasn't happened yet on a more grand scale? And how could we get there?
Great question. All right, thank you. Another question from the audience. Yeah, thank you, Yusuf.
Hello, my name is Jesse Marsh-Pelsnick, and I'm from Albion College. I'm a student there. And I have a question directed mostly towards Tony Hall. I'm just curious about how the government shutdown and how that has affected programs such as WIC, and those are programs that help feed people, and how that is harmful towards your cause of trying to end hunger in the United States and abroad. And especially after 2 weeks, how a lot of those programs will lose all funding altogether.
Okay, great question. Thank you. Another question? Yeah, right here up in the front. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Rashmini. I'm from the Organization for Visual Progression. I have a question for Rosalie and Bill. When speaking about integrating human rights and development practice, both of you all shared stories. Bill from from a story in India, and then Rosalie from Africa. What I've noticed in Sri Lanka is especially when you're working with communities under a repressive government, groups or organizations working for infrastructural development, in infrastructural development in particular, they are viewed as allies of the community and the government. But when there are groups working for human rights and the protection of human rights, they're immediately labeled as the enemy of the state. So maybe based on your experiences, how do you guys counter this or address this issue?
Great question. Let's take one more up front here, and then we'll turn it over to the audience, or the panelists, starting with Mark.
Hi, I'm Nicole Gehring from Wayne State University. This question is mainly for Rosalie, but if anyone else has a response, I'd love to hear it as well. Regarding collecting information at the time of service provision or alongside service provision, what kind of ethical issues might that raise for organizations? So in terms of trying to make clear to the source or the subject that the service provision doesn't depend on or rely on that information gathering. As researchers and scholars who work in development and human rights, are you bound by similar kind of ethical considerations that a scholar working with an IRB would be constrained by? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Excellent questions. Mark, you want to start us off?
So the question was, why aren't we doing more why isn't there more collaboration? And I mean, I touched on that briefly. There's plenty of collaboration between human rights NGOs and human rights NGOs and development NGOs and other elements of civil society. I'm just calling for more. But the question is, why isn't there more? I'm sort of begging the question. One of the things that, there's competition between organizations where there's resources, and look, we just went through this 2-year process of we knew we wanted to create a human rights center here because we have 20 years of human rights activism. We got, as the president provost said yesterday, we got a Catholic emeritus identity that says you should do something about social justice. So we knew we were going to build a human rights center. We spent 2 years working on the mission, and then another 2 years refining the mission with a real attention to what will appeal to the Ford Foundation. Or Lou, are you here? What will appeal to people who we're going to need to help us? And we were quite conscientiously thinking about where we fit this niche. We were also very careful, to say we're not going to chase money. We're going to do these type of things. So there's competition things. Another thing I want to point out very quickly is, and I mean this in the spirit of constructive critique for this conference. There are a lot of fads. There are a lot of human rights fads. In a short period of 20 years or so I've been in human rights education and research, I've just seen it go from one thing for another. Female genital mutilation, and it's human trafficking, and then it was sex trafficking, pretty soon it'll be forced labor, and those are all important things. But one of the things we had to look at is that, sometimes the attention that's given to an issue might be driven, say, by a celebrity who thinks that Nepal is more important than Rwanda. So collaboration's really hard when you're trying to, you're bouncing off things. And this is why we think that focusing on structural causes and focusing on advocacy will allow us to, in a very, this is Joel's phrase, be nimble and, move in a consistent and constructive way to issues and help organizations. But I think there's not more competition. I guess the next question I know Tony's going to take, it was directed to me too, the question about U.S. policy. The government shutdown. If the government were operating, they would cut SNAP, right? That's what they were going to do. So the fact that they're not funding SNAP because they're not operating just means it delays them funding SNAP. It's pathetic. Alex DeWall made this point. Juan Mendez in the video just saw this point. Just the fierce and justifiable critique of the United States now. When I started this, when I got involved, Jimmy Carter was president of the United States, and think of Jimmy Carter, what you may, but he thought about human rights. Now, we were under criticism, the United States, because we thought we were exceptional and, we were going to push foreign policy. There was some validity to those critiques about the United States, sort of, arrogance, moral arrogance about that. But look where we are now. No one's complaining that we're pushing our human rights agenda. Now the idea is not only we abandon the human rights agenda, we are the principal. Look what we did with torture. Not only we did it, we legalized it. Right? And we wrote those Office of Legal Counsel memos saying that it's not torture unless it's severe physical pain or suffering, and you'd have a president has constitutional authority to do this. I was on a colleague of mine was on a panel with John Woo, who wrote one of the torture memos, and he was just flat out asked. This guy was in Office of Legal Counsel. He's now at Berkeley. Does the President of the United States, in time of war, under his commander-in-chief authority, have the legal constitutional authority to order that a 2-year-old boy's testicles be crushed in a vice? And he said yes. So when you got those sort of legal, so the United States has gone from being, whatever you may thought of us as the champion of human rights, we may now be the critical obstacle to human rights protection in the world today.
I'll try to address both questions too. What has happened that we haven't worked together? I can speak for the hunger community pretty well because I'm connected with the hunger community, not only in Washington but in many parts of the world, and I suspect that the human rights community is very similar. I'll never forget going to Haiti a few years ago, and I was chairman of the Select Committee on Hunger then, and I said, I'm going to be down there for a couple of days. Can we get the NGOs, the non-government organizations together? I'd like to speak to them. Let's have breakfast. And so they got, I think, 35 of the big groups in Haiti together. They were the top NGOs, and so we talked and went through a number of things. And the last question I asked, I said, when's the last time you've been together? We said, well, we never have been together. I said, wait a minute. You're the top groups. Most of the money down here is coming through you, and you have never gotten together and worked together. I said, there's got to be a tremendous duplication of money here and resources and bureaucracy. He said, well, yeah. That's one of the big problems that we have. We don't work together well. We need to work together better. The hunger community is doing much better in that. We have what we call circle protection this year that we have formed the last couple of years, made up of a lot of different groups, evangelical groups, Protestant groups, Jewish groups, Islamic groups, that we are working together to fight these cuts. We've been successful so far, but we are worried about these government cuts. And these government cuts are hurting. Of course, they're going to hurt the WIC program. They're going to hurt the Head Start program. They're going to hurt what we call the 150 account. 150 account are the monies that go overseas. They are the monies that go to our poverty programs overseas, feeding programs, sanitation programs, development programs, microcredit programs, food security programs, et cetera. And those are programs of which are not protected, and they don't have a constituency. The people that we represent, you represent, I represent, they don't have a voice. We are their voice. And unless we start to band together, unless we start to work together, our voice is going to be shrill. We can do better. If we could just maybe come together like the human rights community, let's say, and you all got different human rights. Some of you are doing trafficking, some of you are doing disappearances, some of you are doing torture, some of you are doing this, that, all good stuff. But let's say we picked a couple issues a year and we worked on it together. We could make a difference. We could make a difference. Instead of being scattered and doing the shotgun approach, you could still work on your issues. But we don't do this, and it's because of competition and because we have to raise our own money, because of our own little constituencies. And it's why we have a church on every corner in this country. And you have a church on every corner in this country, and every church has got their own food drive, and they got their own clothing drive, and they got their own this and that. Why do you have to have 4 drives on 4 corners? Why doesn't one church do the food, the other do the this and that, work together? And this is standard across this country. We can do better. And I know the human rights community, if we could band together, if we could do 1 or 2 issues a year, we can accomplish so much more.
Thank you. I'll turn it over to Bill. Thanks.
Okay, first, on the government shutdown, don't get me started. I'm afraid I really have a panic attack up here, so I think everything's been said that could be said. It's a total disaster. It's embarrassing. I don't know what else to say. I have a quick thing on why, human rights groups and development NGOs haven't been working as much together as would be ideal. Two quick things. The first is, these fields developed over time in different ways in different places organically, and with different goals and different missions. And so I don't think we should feel too bad that we haven't yet reached nirvana. I think a lot of us are working much more closely together because we see where the mutual interest is from the perspective of the people we're trying to help. And there is a lot more. The limit to me right now is not so much competition, it's time, which is to say collaboration means meetings. I don't have enough time. So we're collaborating at CRS now. We have our new head came from business school. So we're collaborating with business, universities, much more, human rights groups, environmental groups. The impact of that is rather than working a 10-hour day, I'm working a 12-hour day or a 14-hour day. I'm willing to do that. However, that's what the limit is. I don't have more staff to throw at more problems. But so how efficiently and effectively to get the right people together at the right time on the right issues that's going to make a difference, I think we're all kind of getting better at. And I'm hoping really that this collaboration with Dayton is going to mean they're working 14 hours, not me. On the really good question on Sri Lanka and just this question of how development actors are great when they're helping build the road that the government wants built and are enemies of the state when they start questioning the state. And I can't remember who said they call me a saint when I feed someone, when I ask why she's hungry. Yeah, then I'm a communist. And that is the response of most governments. Most governments don't like to be criticized. We can get away with it, with reasonably well here, but that's not the case in many places. Our job at CRS, at least, is we're not the ones who are really going to criticize a local government, but where our partners, particularly the Catholic Church, has the standing, the capacity, and wants help with that capacity, and wants help to make ties outside so that they feel that they're not alone, then we are able to do that. We can't tell them what to do. They're the ones who ultimately have to live there and have to make it, assess their own risks. But we can help them if that's what they choose to do. But it is a very difficult and real situation. The last thing, just on research, collecting information along with service provisions, at least for CRS, we are, we have our own protocol that follows the ethical requirements that standard academic research does, including informed consent and, we all have to sign some document saying we're aware of this as a matter of policy, and so I can say that much without getting into it further.
Thank you. Okay, I have a question from Rashmin. So, like CRS, as you know also, AJWS, for instance, we do not have a physical presence on the ground, and we don't engage directly with government, and when our partner are facing security issues, we support them to be able to have access with other service provider that can advise them on how to develop security plans, for instance, for their organization, or to speak with other organizations that are doing the kind of work that they're doing, but who are more successful in terms of mitigating the security concern that they have. And one other thing that we do is to get the partner to think about ways of framing their work and engaging with the government without always being confrontational, because those allies, you also need them to be able to address the issue that you're working, and sometimes the confrontation doesn't work. You have to find ways to get them to become allies, but at the same time to get them to account. And when there is a serious security issue, and if an activist need to relocate, we have made grant to organization to have the resources that they need to mitigate those security concerns. Talking about the issue of the ethical issues. So the grants partner, they're not collecting the data just for AJWS. They're collecting the data for their own advocacy needs, and they always ask for consent from the survivors before collecting data. And honestly, things are really so bad in the DRC now that this is no longer a problem, because the partner that I'm speaking about, they have safe shelters, and they don't go after the survivors. People come to them because they now, like women and girls, many people, they want to speak out. They're like so tired and fed up of, you know, being violated all the time, that they have understood that if they don't speak up about the issue, you know, it's not going to be resolved. And this partner has received training from other service providers, like Witness, and they follows really some stringent measure to collect the data. The Women Initiative for Gender Justice, that's an organization that is working with the ICC. They provide them with training on documentation of gender crime. So they really follow some professional way of documenting the data, and it's never done without the consent of the survivors.
Thank you. I think we'll take one more round of questions, if that's all right. Yes, right here. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Sari. I'm a graduate student of engineering here at the University of Dayton. My question is to Mr. OKeefe. I'm sorry to put you on the spot here, but with your project working with a corporation like Walmart that has a long history of human rights violations, does your organization just overlook these violations, or have you gotten any word about what they're doing about that? And then the other question is, when teaching farmers about standards, meaning certain standards, is it about conforming to seed patent laws in the US, or what kind of standards are they? Thank you.
Thank you. It's an excellent question, and we'll take a couple more, and when we responded, like Ambassador Hall, to also speak to the role of corporations, as there are a number of corporations that are part of his World Hunger Alliance. So, other questions? Yeah, Yusuf in the back, thanks.
I wanted to expand more on legislation that's being done to either defund or limit funding to human rights organizations. And you mentioned in Ethiopia that this was happening, and I don't know if there was any development or other sort of funding organizations taking the position of combining these efforts, as it seems to be emerging in more countries, and the moment it ends up feeling like a bit of a flash fire, that it emerges and you have to contact all your diplomats and run around, and then it dies down, and it's become, I think, a very ad hoc response from local organizations when this legislation comes up, and if there is room for wider cooperation with these laws.
Great, thank you. Another question? Yeah, right here in the front.
Hello, my name is Lauren. I'm from Ohio University. And I think a lot of times when we're talking about human rights and we're talking about justice and accountability, it's very reactive and not very preventative. And so I was just wondering if you could speak to how you think that actually may be restricting the ability to integrate human rights and development as a prevention for future human rights abuses.
Okay, thank you. One more question, Teresa.
Good afternoon, I'm Teresa Segi. I'm in the English department here at UD. Thank you all for your comments. So my question is, when we talk about development, there's a lot of different ideas about what development means. And so I was curious, actually going to Rosalie, you had the example thinking about indigenous peoples in Zacatecas in Mexico, right? And reacting to mining interests coming in, and of course on one model, this is a kind of development, right? And so there's competing ideas, you know, cross-culturally, and thinking about what development is, what forms of development are positive and in the interest of the local people. And this of course dovetails with Bill's comments about privileging the interest and desires of the people who actually have to live in these places. But I imagine this is, you know, complex territory to negotiate when you're working on an international, you know, sort of sphere and trying to also privilege those local and indigenous voices. So any comments I'd appreciate.
Great, thank you so much. I'll allow each of the panelists a few minutes to respond. If you could all keep your comments to just 2 or 3 minutes to give give everyone a chance to have a break before our last panel. I think that would be welcome. But I think this issue of the tensions between a human rights-based approach and development, as many of these questions raise, is really at the center of this last round. So, you want to begin, Mark, or?
Well, the first, I mean, there was the questions I thought were addressed there that I could competently answer had to do with accountability and then the definition of development. But there were previous questions about putting out the fires.
Mm-hmm.
You want to start with those, and I'll get to these?
Yeah. Would you like to start?
I think the question was asked about Walmart. What do you do about corporations that maybe have had some bad publicity? And I run this organization called the Alliance to End Hunger, and we were formed out of an organization called Bread for the World, which is a 100% Christian organization. And the reason why we were formed, the Alliance to End Hunger, which was about 9 years ago, is that we felt that to address the issue of hunger and to work on building political will and public will, that we had to bring everybody into the table, not just Christians. It had to be Muslims, Christians, Jewish groups, corporations, universities, nonprofits. So we aggressively went after corporations and all of them. Like my nonprofits are World Vision, Catholic Relief Services, Catholic bishops, heifer organizations, Feed the Children, you name it, we have a lot of them. My corporations are Cargill, Monsanto, Land of Lakes, Mosaic, big corporations, billions of dollars, and universities, and then we have Islamic Relief, Jewish organizations, etc. The point I'm making is that some of these corporations are so big, yeah, they've had some problems. We have a nominating committee, and they have to be voted in, and we had some problems with some of them. And a lot of questions were asked, and we went through this whole process of asking them very direct and very tough questions. My feeling is, bring everybody into the room. A lot of these corporations and companies have really strong social consciousness today. They are developing. There's a lot of good people in these corporations. We can learn from them. We can learn about logistics, we can learn about seeds, we can learn about agriculture, we can learn about a lot of things that can help people in Africa and Asia, and we need them. And at the same time, we can also work on them, you know, with their problems that they might have, some of the violations that are occurring, maybe alleged violations, which we do. I'd rather have them inside the room working with them than outside the room not working with them. And that's our philosophy. And I'm telling you, when I go in to see congressmen and senators, governors, and those kind of people, that's who we work on to try to change their opinion about these things. When I walk in from somebody with Monsanto, and somebody from the Catholic Relief Services, somebody from Heifer, and somebody from Auburn University, the senator says, geez, this is amazing. You know, normally, if you walk in with a human rights group, it's all human rights activists. But when you walk in with people that have a diversity of power, a diversity of interest, this really gets they take a look at this and it gets their attention. And you know what? I want to get their attention. I want to let them know that these people are serious about hunger. You can only join my organization if you're serious about hunger. If you're here to talk about your product in Walmart or Monsanto, you can't join. You're here to talk about hunger and to help us. Let's bring them into the room. Let's talk to them. Let's make them part of us, make them part of hunger, and they can help us solve the problem. We've got to bring them in. It's crazy to keep them out, unless they're so odious. I mean, and the ones we have are not odious.
On Walmart, you know, first I'll confess, I am a complete snob. If I were in charge of the economy, I've been in a Walmart 2 times. I go to like these little boutique stores and spend a mass fortune to buy every little thing, and that's my little vision that I have. But the farmers in Nicaragua are looking for somewhere to sell their crops, and I'm not going to be the one to tell them don't sell to the largest buyer, which is Walmart, because I don't like them. There's nothing in Catholic social teaching against the idea of a corporation. We have a very pro-engagement strategy. I can't say for sure what we've talked about. You know, in Walmart, it's tough. Like, we have a project in Nicaragua around buying produce. I doubt our folks in Nicaragua have talked with them about the whole range of Walmart's issues, which as a global corporation, there's a lot of things that they're doing wrong and right. But I think our general strategy is, from the perspective, the folks there, they don't want to be subsistence farmers. They want to be able to sell their produce, and we're helping them to do that. The standards we're helping them to meet are like, you know, the lettuce has to be of this quality and this size, otherwise we can't buy it. And so they have, that's the kind of standards we're talking about, is sort of like, in order for us to buy your product, it has to be fit these specifications. Maybe that's the best way to put it. But it is tough, and but that's kind of how we've handled it. I don't really know anything about the legislation to defund human rights organizations. I'm going to have to pass. The reactive versus preventative is a really good question, and I think I'm going to need to think a little bit more about that, and sort of prevention of human rights abuses. You know, our early warning system may be sort of a part of that, except for it's really a response to millions of people dying already, so I don't know if we can take credit for that. I think it's a good question. It needs further thought, though. And then finally, what does development mean? These competing cross-cultural ideas. You know, that's, I think where we come down is, it's really for the people who are there to decide what development means for them. And that means they may want to mine there because they may want a job, and they may, but they may want it with certain conditions, and we'll support them in that. And they may want it to respect their culture. It's not our place to really tell them that, but it's one of the limitations of human rights, I think. I mean, even in this conversation, I have to say, like CRS, there are rights in some groups that the Catholic Church does not consider rights. Catholic Church and CRS does not consider artificial contraception and reproductive freedom to be a human right. And that's a limitation in the discourse from our perspective, and that's not what we believe is the right approach to development. So there are competing and different views of development, and but in the example of extractives and that you gave, which I think is a great example, our goal is to support the people who are there to figure out where they want to go, and it's not ours to tell them.
So to build on your last response about the meaning of development, I'll say the same thing. We don't go in with a predefined notion of what is development, but on the flip side, we do decide what kind of project we want to support. So on the flip side, we go with that, that in mind. And in general, we take our cues from the partners. So if they would rather, confront other corporation and want to think about what kind of project that they want to see in the community, we're going to, support them to document the right violation and see how they can go about doing that. But if in the other end they want more, to work more on revenue sharings, like having voices and decision making in the management or governance of the natural resources, then we'll work with them on that. But that also has to fit with the strategic priorities that we are pursuing. So we try to meet them, really in the middle. The issue about reaction, the reactive approach to justice and accountability, I must say that we're not working just on responding. We're also working on preventing. Like in Liberia, we're working on land issues now because many of our partners have told us that if there were to be another civil war in Liberia, it's likely going to come from tension and conflict over land. So in the southeastern region of Liberia, we are working with community group so that they can manage tension over land between Liberians who were living abroad and now they are returning in the country, and internally displaced people, and even the government who is trying, to get investor in Liberia and having contracts with them without consulting their people. So we're working on preventions as well. The third question about legislation. Yes, unfortunately, we haven't dealt with that issue in Ethiopia. I know that many of our partners have had to find ways to frame their work and to really work underground and use a cover for their work. So we haven't dealt with that, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you. And Mark, the final brief word?
Okay, so well, these questions. You never said it to me when you were a student, when you never said role reversal is wonderful. So I'm going to take this question of corporate social responsibility. I used to be a biblical scholar. I got to trot this out every now and then. So the Pharisees go to Jesus' disciples and says, "Why does your master eat with tax collectors and sinners?" Right? So I fully endorse this idea of engagement with corporations. With this project we will do with Catholic Relief Services and the Pastoral Land Commission and others in Brazil, looking at evidence of slavery and supply chains and products we might consume. The advocacy piece of that, that research will support an advocacy phase where we want to raise corporate awareness of this and promote corporate social responsibility. My guess is a lot of corporations don't realize and would welcome engagement and to work with us to eradicate these. I mean, this conference was made possible by someone who worked their entire life in the corporate world and saw a lot of the abuses that we talk about and has done something about it. So I believe in corporate engagement. On accountability versus prevention, yeah, we'd like to prevent everything. But I'd like to echo Juan, and I really wish Juan and Alex DeWall had sort of in the same room. I'm just a hardliner on this. You prosecute them. If you can't prosecute them now because they're head of state, and you got to wait till you prosecute them. These are crimes against humanity. They are not pardonable, maybe in a religious sense, but not in a legal one. You prosecute, and I think holding people accountable, prosecuting them for the worst crimes, is a form of prevention. It's a deterrence. So I really think you do that. And on a prevention side, I think to repeat our focus in the center on looking at structural causes. If you really want measures of prevention, you got to address structural causes. On the question of development, what does that mean? We have close affinity with the integral human development model. Development means developing the free and full development of the human personality of the person created in the likeness and image of God. Right? Whether you take a secular approach to human rights or a religious one, that's the sense we're talking about. In terms of development to communities, I believe in informed consent of indigenous peoples, wherever, if someone's going to come in and it's going to be extractives or anything else. That's really cool. We're bringing Jim and Naya back to campus after many, many years. He worked with indigenous peoples in the Mosquito Coast to basically say this. You need informed consent if you're going to do this. But what is development? Development isn't just simply increasing, the material production of a country or a community. It really means lifting the human being to fulfill the full human potential that God intended for each of us. Thank you.
Please help me in thanking our panelists for